Hey, all right, everyone. It's just me tonight. So yeah, because Shannon and Will have both got more interest in lives than me. So yeah, let me just sort my screen out a minute. Bear with me, guys. Um, why is it not working? Awesome. Here we go. Cool. I'm hoping that still works for everyone else. Okay, so yeah, basically just me. I've got 4 questions that have come in during the week, and there's already a question in the live chat, which I'll probably come to first. As always, just with the questions in the live chat, please don't disclose personal information. Just ask the question as if they're about someone else, because it just makes it a little bit more confidential. The live chat itself won't be visible once the recording goes up, so it's only going to be visible whilst this is going out as live, as far as I can work out. It's not legal advice, obviously. So, this is designed to be helpful and kind of better than, nothing, but it's certainly not a substitute for proper legal advice. Something we say a lot is that if you are homeless, you might not realize it, but you are basically in a legal situation, which you want to get a solicitor for if you can, which is easier said than done, which again is why we kind of do this sort of thing. I think that's pretty much it. So my name is Mike. Deliver training for homelessness best practice. Next date that's open to the public is the 29th of September. So it's a day course online via Zoom for professionals, basically, or kind of members of the public supporting people who are homeless. And we're pretty proud of it. Really, it's a really good course. We've been doing it for years, and it's something which really it's just kind of the basic stuff. So the kind of what we call the 5-part test. So the definitions of homelessness, priority needs, intentional homelessness, local connection, and a little bit about eligibility, and a few other bits and pieces. So it's really it's what you need to know if you're a professional and you're trying to get people housed using housing law, because housing law is actually pretty darn good. So yeah, I think that's it. What else? Yeah, I'll remember anything else as we go along. So the first question we've got coming in on the live stream, essentially we've got a family of 4, and so 2 parents, 2 kids, and they haven't got the ages of the kids, but I'm going to initially assume they're under 18, and both kids have got disabilities. So one's a wheelchair user who's got autism, and another has got epilepsy, and then the partner has also got a neck injury. So this individual is basically caring for the three family members, and they're in a property which has got 20 stairs up to the front door, and have to get the wheelchair up and down there, basically. And there's also other issues in the house itself, or in the flat. So you've got a balcony, and which is not safe because of the kids with autism's inability to kind of be aware of danger. And the family's been served with a notice to quit, which expires soon. So question is, the question actually in the straightforward question is, if they leave, would they be intentionally homeless? And then what's housing's responsibilities for this? So there's probably a number of strands here that would be worth talking about before we even look at housing. So the first thing here is that we've clearly got children with disabilities who would be classified as children in need under the Children Act. We may have an adult as well with a care and support need, depending on what the issue is with the neck. Basically, before we even talk about housing, this individual needs to really make sure they're making the most of children's services. So children's social services would be able to provide quite a lot of support for this family, or they should do anyway. I mean, that they're not going to magic everything away, obviously, but that's something that they would be able to do. So that would start with an assessment of each family member's needs, or each child's needs. And then they would kind of look at, okay, what, is there additional stuff that needs to happen? And there'd also be stuff around kind of supporting the adult in terms of them being a carer. So it's not just about the children, it would be about the adult as well. And then you've got, as I say, potentially as well, if the other adult in the household's got care and support needs, then again, they may well be able to qualify for help under the Care Act itself, or that's probably less likely. So that's the first thing I'd say. That's the reason I'm kind of mentioning that first, is that's going to improve this family situation anyway, in terms of the support they've got. It would also mean that they're going to have some robust assessments of the family members' needs as they approach housing, because they need to approach housing now. They are threatened with homelessness right now, so they can make a homeless application because it's likely they'll become homeless within 56 days. Quite frankly, I would probably question, I'd probably say that this family is already legally homeless, because it's not reasonable to continue to occupy. It's not reasonable to continue to occupy this accommodation because of the fact it's not suitable for someone with a wheelchair. But that may not matter anyway in this situation, because they're basically, they'd be given a notice to quit. So as I say, caring responsibilities will deal with, hopefully kind of dealt with them in terms of going to children's services. Next thing to do is to, as I say, approach housing options via email. Never do it via the phone or walking into a customer service centre. Always do it via email. And the first thing you want to do is you want to copy or send a copy of the notice to quit into the council, because the first thing they want to know is the notice to quit valid? Often landlords don't know how to do them properly, so they won't be valid. And that means that in that sense, you're not homeless because there's a valid notice to quit has been served. The landlord would then need to go away and work out how to serve a valid notice before you'd be able to kind of go down that route. However, as I say, whether or not the notice is valid, it would almost be certain that this family is already going to be homeless, because it's not reasonable to continue to occupy this accommodation indefinitely because of the kind of the mobility issues. So that's the kind of the very first thing you do. And on this, basically simultaneously, what you also want to do is basically apply to the council's online housing register system, the application form. Different councils do it different ways, but basically usually they're online, and there's a whole series of questions and a whole bunch of information you need to provide afterwards. But you want to get that stuff in as soon as possible anyway, because again, it's likely you're going to probably score fairly high on the banding already. You'd need to read the council's housing allocation scheme to actually know how it works, because every area is really different. We're seeing that more and more actually in terms of the differences between different areas. So you actually need to Google it, whatever your local council is, plus housing allocation scheme. And you can look at how people get awarded into these different bands. So there'll be, bands for like urgent medical need, for example. You might get band A for that, or there's kind of a whole formula of things. And crucially, in one sense, families can, or any single people as well, can effectively get penalised for making a homeless application. That's, the council's not going to say it like that, but basically, sometimes you have situations where you'd get a band A in this situation if you just made a housing register application, but then if you went down the homeless route, you potentially drop down the banding, as crazy as that sounds, even though you're in more urgent need. So that's something you want to be aware of as well, which is why, again, you want to have a competent advocate or a solicitor on your side anyway, because they're quite, they're probably, I don't know, between 10 and 30 pages long, and although it should be really reasonably easy to navigate to find the bits that you need to know, it's obviously, if it's new to you, it's going to be quite difficult to really make sure you're confident with it. So the person's just kind of added that they've done everything and sent all the medical evidence. So again, taking that at face value, if let's assume that the notice is valid for a second. The Homelessness Code of Guidance, which is like the rule book for councils, basically says that councils should not expect people to remain in the property past that date, the expiry date of that notice. However, in some situations, you're better off staying put. So you need to have a sensible conversation with the housing officer and say, look, what's our options? And bear in mind that housing officers will try and put you off as much as they can. So they might say, oh, well, we've got nothing at all, this side of like Durham or something, if you're in Bedford or London or whatever. But they would, when it actually comes to it, maybe you get a better offer, but you're in this impossible situation where you just don't know enough information to make that choice. So it might be you might say, actually, we're better off staying put for the very short term, so that we can avoid that chaos of going into temporary accommodation. As I say, there's no sensible way that I can kind of give information to say how you're going to work that out or not. As I say, if you've got a competent advocate who knows that council, they'll know how the council works, and they'll be able to give you a better indication of what type of accommodation they're likely to give you and so on. But it's not, you're in for a rough ride no matter what. Now, it's really important that when you make that initial homeless application email, which has got that notice to quit copied in, that you are spelling out as clearly as you possibly can what the disabilities, what disabilities are present in your family household makeup, and not just So in this case, almost this particular child with who's a wheelchair user and has autism, and potentially the other child with epilepsy, are almost certainly going to have disabilities. Those conditions are likely to result in a long-term impairment. Or an impairment that causes a substantial long-term impact on their ability to carry out day-to-day living activities. Which, as I say, I'd be amazed if those conditions didn't meet that threshold. If you spell it out to a council, you're basically you're setting yourself up to be in a stronger position. So under the Equality Act, councils have to be really, really careful about how they deal with people with disabilities. They need to be really careful that they properly assess that person. They properly assessed any reasonable adjustments they need to make, and so on. So a really clear one here would be that any temporary accommodation they offer is going to need to be wheelchair accessible, just as a straightforward one. Having said all that, in lots of councils, the housing officers have never had training on the Equality Act. So you are almost going to have to be, educating them in terms of what they need to do. So if but by basically spelling out what your issues are, you've set yourself up to be in a better position down the line if they were to then try to offer you something which is just not suitable, because you can say, look, I've told you on this date that this, my particular child has this need, and you just basically ignored that. Again, it doesn't magic anything up in the short term unless you've got a solicitor who could then really kind of get very robust with the council's legal team. But again, it does kind of add more and more weight. And what it then means is if you haven't been able to get a solicitor, you can then start calling on local politicians and local councillors and MPs and whatever, emailing the chief exec of the council, because all of those individuals would see the significance of this. They would see the unacceptability of ignoring someone's disabilities more so than a housing officer probably would. So again, the person just asked you, do I think it's better that they leave or stay? It's impossible for me to really give you any kind of indication of that. All I can say is that you want to kind of weigh up the benefits and the pros and cons of both options, of both staying and going. Because as we said elsewhere in previous weeks, the other downside of staying put and being homeless at home is that you potentially go to the bottom of the pile with the council because you're not costing them money. So you are low priority to them. So in some situations, and often you don't know until you're quite a way into making the decision, you're actually better off, putting up with poor quality temporary accommodation because you're higher up the council's priority list in terms of them rehousing you. Again, as we say it every week pretty much, London councils and Birmingham and those kind of places, because there's so much pressure on housing, you are likely to get a much rougher ride than you would do if you are making a kind of a competent homes application elsewhere. That's not to say there are housing officers who are decent in London. There are certainly indecent housing officers elsewhere, but in one sense, you can expect a rough ride if you're in London, and it's why it's so important that you have a solicitor. Again, the good thing about London is there tend to be more solicitors you can access, more firms, kind of geared up towards dealing with homelessness than elsewhere. So that's something you want to kind of basically ring around and try and find someone. Or as I say, I'm not a lawyer, but I've certainly helped a whole lot of people into getting housed by the council, and that's because I've taken the time to actually understand what the rules are. So those sort of professionals do exist, but it's very much a lottery. A lot of homeless workers, they've never heard of any of this, so they won't help you at all. And some other ones, they do know what the law is, and they won't challenge the council because they're funded by them. So it's a very difficult situation. But as I say, if you've gone to children's services and you've got a children's social worker on side who's banging the drum, they again probably won't have having had any training in housing law, but they would be able to certainly kind of bang the drum in terms of the children's care and support needs, and kind of by proxy the parents' kind of needs in terms of supporting those children. So you've got a children's social worker, that's a good thing. If you can get a solicitor or get your social worker to help you find a solicitor, that's puts you in a very strong situation. You've given the council details of your disabilities in making that homeless application, and you've spelled out what the council needs to do. So again, with autism, the council would have needed to explain and be able to evidence how they assess the impact of temporary accommodation on an individual with autism, because again, autism is something where maybe that individual struggles with change, struggles with uncertainty, struggles with loud noises, all those kind of things that they would need to carefully be able to evidence it. And that's why for a solicitor arguing this case, they probably have a lot of ammunition to go on, because my guess would be most councils won't do that stuff very robustly. They won't assess the individual household members' needs. They won't evidence how they've assessed the kind of the offer of accommodation to make sure it's suitable. There will be nothing within the notes to actually demonstrate that. So those are the kind of things that you want to be able to do in that situation. There's probably other things as well that would kind of come into play here. Can't think of them off the top of my head. I'm missing Shannon and Will right now because they probably chip in. But that's my initial answer anyway. Is you want to, whatever happens, you want to get a social worker involved, and any other medical. It might be there are other medical professionals involved in the children's issues as well, who are then providing information and evidence to the council to to kind of back up what you're saying. Yeah, you want to spell out the stuff under the Equality Act, and you want to be very quick to complain and raise it with people outside the housing team. More and more, it's quite depressing, really. I'm seeing housing officers who have just given up, and they kind of say, well, this is just the way it is. There's nothing we can do about it, and there are things they can do about it. But so ultimately, if you can send information about this to someone outside that housing team, like the legal team or like the chief exec, then they're likely to have a more kind of balanced and objective view on things. So yeah, those are the things I'd probably say. So again, I hope that's helpful. I'll probably miss some stuff out there, but if I remember it halfway through, I'll come back to it. So yeah, that's the first question. And we've got another question coming on the live chat. So I'm just going to make sure I'm not mangling this. So local council said that in temporary accommodation, you've got no rights. Property owner allowed to make you live without basic needs, e.g. warm water and heating, and throw you out without notice. That's not true though. Yeah. So I don't know if that's a question or not, but no, that's not true. You've got a right to go to court to appeal things when you're in temporary accommodation. Again, this is something we talked about last week. When we talk about temporary accommodation, it's a bit of a clumsy term because when you are initially accommodated by a council, it's an interim accommodation, which I would often call temporary accommodation, but it's in that interim period where you've made the homeless application and you're waiting for a decision to be made. So it's interim. And in that situation, you can't request a review of the suitability of that accommodation. You can only go to court to do it, which is why you need a solicitor who would find it probably quite easy to win the case. But once a decision's been made, which is either, let's say it's you're in priority need, you're not intentionally homeless, you are then able to request a review of the suitability of that accommodation you're in, even though it might be the same address you're in before, and they've just simply made a decision. So you can do it at that point as well. So yeah, so those are the two questions that come in so far on the live stream. I hope this is all right, guys. Also notice I'm not in my house right now, so I'm having to improvise with the technology a little bit. So apology for the flickering screen. But coming to the next question, I'll kind of go through them in the order they're coming on the comments through the week on the YouTube channel. So, I forgot to say that. If you look at this screen, there should be a little red triangle in the bottom right. If you haven't subscribed already, just subscribe to it. If you ask questions in the comments on videos during the week, I will, as I can do now, I can just pull them up and then go through the ones that we haven't talked about before. So, the first question I'm going to talk about here. So what if the landlord is harassing a tenant and using threatening language? The tenant's not feeling safe and has children. So very common situation. You're probably not homeless, but you could still want to go to a council, approach a council in writing, because housing officers have powers under some housing act somewhere. I don't know which one. I don't know if it's a 1996 one or not. But basically, they can take action to prevent landlords harassing you. So, and as a tenant, you've got this kind of right to enjoy quiet enjoyment of your property, which basically means your landlord can't harass you, can't be abusive, can't turn up out of nowhere, that sort of thing. There's a whole bunch of stuff, and councils can take action. Now, whether it's the homelessness team that deals with that, or whether it's the environmental health team potentially who deal with that, someone will be able to deal with that. So if you're in that situation where a landlord is becoming or is behaving unacceptably, then you want to contact the council. But it's probably not a homeless application yet, unless literally the landlord either illegally evicted you completely in terms of changing the locks, or became incredibly violent and threatening. By which time it would probably be a police issue as well. So yeah, pretty straightforward. You want to contact your council, again, usual stuff, copy your local councillor in, find out who your local councillor is. So if you don't even know who your local councillor is, there's at least one that will cover your address of where you are at the moment. Often there might be up to 3 sometimes. If you go on the council's website, there'll be like a democracy page. It will be called different things, but you can basically go on there and it should say pretty prominently, how to find my council or something like that. And you type in your address or you type in your ward or something like that, and you'll get the names and the contact details for those councillors. I've heard people say that the more councillors you've got, the better, particularly if they're from different parties, because they tend to compete against each other to be to kind of be the one that helps you out. So you want to copy your local councillors in and say, look, this is the issue I've got. My landlord's doing X, Y, and Z. You want to keep a contemporaneous record of what they're doing when. It might be that you document it some way by sending an email to saying, just had the landlord round again and they were effing and jeffing or whatever, because that kind of the contemporaneous nature of that, as in saying it at the time, makes it much more useful down the line. It's when a tenant says, they've been threatening, the first thing the council is going to say is, well, what do they do and when? And so if you've got that record, then it's going to help you at that point. So yeah, hopefully that covers it. Hopefully, if you've got the councillors involved and they, potentially, if it was me, I'd probably copy in the chief exec as well, just because you can, and that's likely to lead to a more robust response. That should hopefully lead to action being taken against the landlord to hopefully stop it. If the landlord was to continue to do it, there's further action they can take. But I don't. This would not ordinarily be a situation where homelessness is involved. As I say, I'm sure in extreme cases it could be, but it's unlikely. So yeah, hopefully that helps. I was going to check. We haven't. So I've got just juggle screens here. Just a follow-up question that's coming from the family with disabled children. So essentially they've asked, well, what happens if we leave by the date of the notice to quit? What's going to happen? Well, that's a good question. You don't want to leave that up to them, on the mercy of the housing team. What you want to do is you want to have contact to the council already, and you want to have agreed any situation like that. So maybe you say, well, we can stay with a family member short term. Make sure the council has agreed to any step you're going to take with that in that respect. So don't just leave the property on that date. Although technically, legally, you should be safe. Don't do it, because the council's going to try and say that this property was available to you and you just left it, and therefore they're going to try and say you're intentionally homeless. You're not intentionally homeless for reasons I've already said, but you don't want to leave. You don't want to just have that stress. So make sure you've contacted the council. Make sure you have agreed in writing everything that you're going to do. So if you've said, well, we can stay at a family member for a few weeks, make sure that's in an email. Make sure the housing officer said, yep, that's fair enough. This is what we're going to do. That very early on in that process, they need to have made an assessment, which is where they, like a documented assessment, where they've looked at why you've become homeless, what type of support you need, and what type of accommodation you need to kind of move into. And then that should be followed by a personalised housing plan. So ideally, I'd say don't really do anything. Don't make any decisions until the PHP has been agreed and been written down. Again, because although you should be okay to leave that property, on the face of the information I've got here, I still wouldn't do it. I'd still make sure that the council's okayed anything like that, just because it avoids stress down the line. Cool. So next question. Got some really nutty questions coming this week from America. Anyway, that's another issue. So we've got another one. This is quite a complicated one. So basically, got a homeless man who's separated with his, I'm going to say wife, I'm going to make that assumption. And basically they jointly own the property, and they've been paying the mortgage, and he's basically paying the mortgage payment so the kids don't get put out on the street. Now, basically the council said they can't help him, which may be correct, but we'll come back to that. And he's basically having no luck at all getting private rented accommodation. And do I have any suggestions as to what he can do? So the council can do things in this situation. If there is no domestic abuse involved, there's no indication that there is. Legally speaking, this guy isn't homeless. Legally, the council can say, you may have, relationship may have broken down with your partner. However, unless there's abuse involved, it's still, the case law basically still says it's reasonable for you to remain there with them, living together. It sounds crazy. It's probably one of the one areas of housing law which I think is, really kind of needs changing. But I think the case is called Moncada or something back from '98, which kind of demonstrated that. But and then, basically, in one sense, the council don't have to accept, well, they don't, you can make a homeless application, but they'll just come back and say you're not homeless, because on the face of it, you're not. So, but that doesn't mean to say that the council can't do anything. The council can exercise its discretion anyway. And it's going to depend on the council. If it's a London council, again, when they've got literally no resources to do anything, then you're going to struggle to get anything. But there would be councils, I work with councils who would potentially step in here. One of the things they could do is to help you into a rent deposit scheme tenancy with a private landlord. This is where it gets tricky. That's gonna hinge on your ability to pay both the mortgage and the rent, because you're not going to get housing benefit initially anyway, because you have too much assets, assuming the house is worth more than whatever the threshold is. But you're going to have too much assets to claim housing benefit, and so that's essentially going to really mean that you're going to have to pay your own way completely. There are other things. I mean, so in one sense, again, the long-term thing here is that you're going to have to probably come up with some kind of arrangement with your partner or ex-partner to look to sell the house and look to to kind of extricate themselves from that situation. But both in a joint tenancy or a jointly owned property, both parties have a right to live there. So you can't kind of make the other person leave. I say that. So Will Flack said something a few weeks ago where he said basically where you've got a joint tenancy, one party can end the tenancy for both people, but we're talking about a jointly owned property here. So I doubt that's possible with a jointly owned property. You're going to have to initially just kind of try to work something out amicably. That's going to enable you to sell the house and then go your separate ways. Potentially she could buy another property or do something to make sure the kids have got something. Other than that, my understanding, which is very limited here, the only way you can kind of force it is to go down the divorce route. But I've worked with a couple of people in this situation before, and first of all, one of them certainly had to wait 5 years for their, the kind of divorce to be legit, because I think they had to kind of show that it was I can't remember the terminology, irreparable damage to the relationship or whatever it was. I can't remember, but yeah, as I say, if the ex-partner doesn't want to play ball, then it's very, very difficult to really take any action at all. So that's why it's going to be so important to try and work something out amicably. And the fact that you own property, as I say, means that you're going to have to be able to afford to cover both the mortgage and the and any rent of any property you go and get. So again, if you can't get anything private rented, if you go to a homeless organisation, they're probably going to tell you to go to a hostel, but you're not going to be able to afford that because hostel rents are ridiculously expensive, and you're not going to be able to get any housing benefit, as far as I know, in that situation because of your assets. So yeah. Let me check if I haven't missed anything so far on the live chat. Yeah, just a comment there about saying how ridiculous it is. You've got to take a council to court if if the temporary accommodation is not suitable. Yeah, again, I don't know what the history is there. It seems to be something that really kind of kind of goes into the hands of a bad council, to be honest. But yeah, that's another story. So yeah, as I say, so going back to this question about the kind of the joint owners of a property, things I would do is email the housing team and say, look, I'm not, it may be that I'm not homeless right now, but still, can you give me some housing advice? Because that, they do have a duty to provide housing advice, and give it to me in writing. And you would hope a competent officer would then write down, what the different considerations are, what the different kind of options are available to that person. And as I say, the council may say, well, actually, we can help you into private rented. But again, it's going to be, it's going to be assuming that you can afford to pay that and the mortgage. If you stop, I mean, and again, you probably want to get a family lawyer involved or a divorce lawyer or whatever, because I'm not quite sure what happens if you stop paying the mortgage. I just have never seen that in my own kind of work, so I don't want to make any kind of claim to know what would happen there. But I think I'd want to want to make sure you've kind of taken advice from a lawyer about that as well, and potentially think a place like Citizen Advice and Shelter, they would be able to provide useful information about this situation as well. But in my experience, this is probably one of the hardest situations to really do anything about, because your options are very, very limited, particularly if the other party doesn't want to cooperate and doesn't want to doesn't want to take action to kind of sort the situation out for both of you. Technically, again, unless there's domestic abuse involved, the other partner can't stop you from living there. But again, that doesn't seem to me like a very good solution for the situation. So yeah, you want to kind of make sure you've taken advice from different areas of law around the divorce proceedings, and you've got that advice from from Housing Options or the homelessness team, whatever they call it. And again, they should be able to sort of spell out, they should be able to explain to you how the benefit system works. So, what the thresholds are on not being able to claim a housing benefit or universal credit or whatever they want to call it there. So, yeah, as I say, it's a difficult situation. It would, the kind of most straightforward one is that both parties agree to sell the property, and as I say, then they both find suitable accommodation for themselves. And I'm going to make the assumption that the partner's going to take the kids with them and find accommodation that way. I would say, and I'm missing Shannon and Will here, but I'd also say that potentially if you were to sell the property and then make a homeless application to a council, as in the partner with the kids, then they may still say that, well, in fact, they probably would say that it was reasonable to continue to occupy, and therefore you're intentionally homeless. So they would initially have that initial duty, that 2 or 3 month duty to provide temporary accommodation, and then children's services may have to kick in. But again, that's not something you really want to aim for. You want to make sure you've actually got, hopefully you're able to kind of come up with other options that are going to be better than that. So let me juggle my screens again. My voice is also going, which is awesome. How far have we only got? Half an hour in so far. So, the first question actually that I missed, I've got to come back to is, now this came up a few weeks ago. It might even be the same person who hasn't watched this, but question about epilepsy and priority needs. So, the question is someone with epilepsy in priority needs? So this is not probably a bad time to kind of, I know I answered it before, it's a pretty short answer, but I could maybe go into a bit more detail this time about this. And I'm going into it not knowing much about epilepsy at all. So obviously what I do know about epilepsy is that it's life-threatening, or can be, particularly if unmedicated, and things like tiredness and stress can lead to an increased risk of the seizures. Equally, I just don't know about stuff. I'm assuming there are plenty of people out there with epilepsy where the symptoms are completely managed by medication. So it may be that in one sense, with that medication, there is, it makes no difference to you. As long as you take the meds, you won't have those seizures. So that's our kind of starting point. Now, as I say, I'll give you a whistle-stop tour of vulnerability and therefore priority needs. So there are certain situations where you'd automatically be in priority needs. So things like pregnancy, having dependent children, being homeless because of domestic abuse, being age 16 or 17 and having already had a children acts assessment been done, and 18 to 20-year-old care leavers if they hit a certain criteria in terms of being a former relevant child. And I feel like I've missed one out. Oh yeah, homeless as a result of fire and flood or other natural disaster. So those groups of people would automatically be in priority needs. But the other reason you'd be in priority need is that you're vulnerable. But that word vulnerable means something very specific within housing law. So there's a really good video that Sarah Steinhardt did on this channel, which I'm just going to copy and paste into the chat for anyone interested. So it's like a half hour long or something. She does a much better job than I'm going to do right now about it. But in a nutshell, let me give you a condensed version. In a nutshell, the question is, if you were to compare yourself, so someone with epilepsy, with essentially a healthy and robust person who specifically doesn't have epilepsy, is there any difference between your ability to deal with the consequences of homelessness that would differentiate you from a healthy and robust person who became homeless? So that's really kind of our starting point with this. So again, with epilepsy, the question would be is, even with medication, even if you're able to access your medication and take it regularly, and it may be that homelessness actually impairs your ability to take it. I don't know anything about medication about epilepsy. It might be that you've got to store it in a fridge, or it might be that it has to be taken very regularly, and it might be that being homeless impairs your ability to take things regularly, all those kind of things. But so the question would be is, is if you became homeless, are you going to be at risk of some sort of harm that an ordinary healthy and robust person wouldn't? And I'm using the terms ordinary, healthy and robust from a big case about this called HOTAC. And if the answer is yes, if there's anything significant, as in something that makes a notable difference or notably differentiates you from a healthy and robust person, then you are vulnerable. But obviously it's an area which councils, because it's a complicated kind of test, then councils officers tend to either not understand it or they tend to apply it really badly. So what you'd probably want is you'd want clear medical evidence which basically says Joe Bloggs has epilepsy, as and it's epilepsy which is not is not completely managed by medication, and therefore if Joe Bloggs became homeless, he would be at risk of harm that a healthy and robust person would not be, as in someone without epilepsy would not be. So it may be, as I say, that, you know, because if you're homeless, you're unlikely to sleep well and you're likely to be stressed. If that was going to lead to an increased risk of harmful effects or increased risk of, you know, seizures or whatever, then you are in priority needs. You are vulnerable and therefore in priority needs. But the evidence needs to be clear. As I say, it's not just enough for a doctor to confirm a diagnosis. And in many cases, a counsellor would simply ask for a patient summary, which might confirm that you've got epilepsy, but it won't go as far as saying, is it properly is it properly medicated? Is it properly treated? Are the symptoms kind of properly dealt with by that medication or that treatment program? And those are the things you want to get. So in one sense, if you're an advocate, particularly, or the individual yourself, you have got an advantage in that you are likely to be able to get more information, or information that a counsel would not ask for, because they just won't ask for detailed information from your GP. They might invoke a kind of an independent, so-called independent medical kind of advisor, who won't know you, won't ever really see your file, won't know a lot about you, won't ever speak to you, won't ever see you. And case law is pretty clear that, you know, even if a medical advisor like that said that you weren't vulnerable, or said that, you know, there was no issue with you, if your GP says there was an issue with you, or if a specialist in the hospital that was treating you said there was an issue, that evidence should basically trump what the independent medical advisor is saying. But as I say, that's a real kind of very, very condensed version of it. But check out that video from Sarah Steinhardt on the channel, because she's a deputy district judge and a barrister, and she knows more than I do. So, and she does a really good job of kind of expounding it. There's some cases which she kind of cites, which really kind of hone in on what that question is, because it's easy to lose or kind of lose kind of sight of what the question actually is. You know, as I say, it's not the fact that, you know, the social services might say this is a vulnerable individual, but that in itself doesn't mean that you're vulnerable under housing law. And there is no list of kind of medical conditions which will or will not be make you vulnerable. So epilepsy is something that certainly can do, as is depression, as is pretty much any medical condition under the sun. But it's all about how, essentially, you know, as I say, how it would be affected, or how you would be affected if you became homeless. And are you at more risk of harm than a person without that condition would be if they became homeless? So yeah. And then the final question that's come in. So again, guys, I'm going to stop as soon as I can because my voice is going. So unless there are more questions coming in the chat, I will stop this after I've answered this next question, which is not it's not a terribly complicated one. So get your questions in quick. So basically, question just about, you know, what can I do if I can't afford my rent? So starting at the basics, if you can't afford your rent, first thing you need to do is kind of, you know, make a universal credit claim, and that's pretty obvious to most people, so I'm going to assume that that's already been done. But it's entirely possible, particularly if you're in private rented accommodation, that you still won't be able to afford your rent, because there'll be a shortfall between what you can get, which is kind of limited by what's called by the local housing allowance. I did a video about that not too long ago, actually went into a bit of detail about it. But the local housing allowance, the LHA, kind of sets out what's the upper limit you'll get for a particular type of housing in your area. And as I say, most private rented accommodations is way more than that. So it may well be that you're already claiming universal credit and you're still not enough to get to kind of cover the rent. So the next thing you do, as weird as it might sound, is you make a homeless application, because housing law basically says if you genuinely cannot afford your rent, then it's not reasonable to continue to occupy your property indefinitely, and therefore you're homeless. You know, you don't need to get into rent arrears or get evicted for rent arrears to become homeless. You're already homeless. And what that means is the council's probably not going to house you anywhere else, but probably what they will do is they'll make a what's called a discretionary housing payment on your behalf, which is far more likely to succeed than it would be if you made it on your own. So they would talk to their colleagues in the DHP team, who would potentially consider increasing your income by making a payment to you, to basically bridge that shortfall. Whilst they should also be looking at how do you try to find more affordable accommodation, but that's often not possible anyway. They kind of know that. So what can end up happening is that you end up just making a series of DHP applications every 3 months to kind of increase your income. So it's in no way a peaceful way to live. It's a very stressful way to live, but it is something which short term can help. And then maybe, there may be other options you're just not aware of that the housing team would be aware of that would be more suitable. So again, making a housing register application and looking at the housing allocation scheme to look at how the banding works would be very useful at that point, because it may be that someone who's been found homeless, or somebody who owes who's owed the relief duty or something like that, which potentially would kick in, they may get a fairly high banding depending on which council it is. So you may be, you could feasibly try and get social housing, which is likely to be more affordable than private rented. So yeah, and again, other things that to consider would be is if you have a disability, making sure you've claimed PIP, because although that shouldn't be for your rent, pragmatically speaking, you can use it for your rent. And there may be some other benefits. So again, you want to talk to the DWP and make sure your universal credit claim is kind of you're getting what you should be getting, talking to your coach or whatever. So yeah, let me just check there's no other questions come in. Doesn't look like it. So I'm going to call it a night, guys. As I say, my voice is going already. So as far as I know, me, Will and Shannon will be back next week. So on the 24th or something like that. So 7:30. So keep the questions coming in. Apologies that it's just me tonight, and apologies my voice is not brilliant. Not been particularly well the last few days. But yeah, as I say, hope it helps. If you haven't subscribed already, do all that stuff, and keep the questions coming in. We're looking at getting some kind of new sort of experienced people or people with particular experiences onto this live stream chat. So I think we're probably likely to do one which focuses on domestic abuse. So we'll have a group of people who are kind of really got a lot of expertise with that, and there might be some other themes as well we could pick out that kind of does the same thing in other areas. So yeah, I will hopefully see you next week, guys. Yeah, thanks for coming tonight. Thanks for the questions. And I'm hoping it's been reasonably helpful. Take care. Bye bye.